The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon to everyone in Asia, and good morning and evening if you're connected to this webinar from elsewhere. I'm Kevin Teo, COO at ABPN, and I'll be facilitating today's webinar. A special welcome to the many representatives from ABPN member organizations joining us today. Thank you for your continued engagement and support. For those of you who might be new to ABPN, our mission is to build a vibrant and high-impact venture philanthropy community across the Asia-Pacific. And we do this by advocating the venture philanthropy approach, bringing ABPN members together in roundtable and sharing events, and also building capacity through webinars, workshops, and our Knowledge Center. There are currently 142 ABPN members in our community from across 22 countries. Today's webinar on Internal Dynamics and the Contest for the Nation will be presented by Dr. Maitrii Thwin, Associate Professor of Myanmar and Southeast Asian History from the National University of Singapore. Maitrii's research has been concerned with the histories of domination, resistance, and identity in Southeast Asia during the late colonial age. He has pursued these interests through studies on intellectual communities and the production of knowledge. Most of his research is situated in the specific context of colonial and post-colonial Myanmar. He is co-author of the recent publication, A History of Myanmar Since Ancient Times. For those of you connected to the webinar via your computers, you should see a small widget for the GoToWebinar software, and within this widget, there'll be a box where you can type in questions to the presenter. Feel free to submit questions as Maitrii reviews his presentation. I will group these questions as they come in and will raise them to Maitrii during the question and answer segment. This should hopefully address most of the common questions, but if you would like to contact Maitrii later, his contact information will be available on the last slide of the presentation. And now, without further ado, let me turn over the presentation to Maitrii.
Thanks very much for having me, Kevin. And thanks very much for joining me today, all the guests of this ABPN webinar. The title of the talk today will be Myanmar in Context, Internal Dynamics, and the Contest for the Nation. And essentially that's what we're going to be talking about and focusing today, is really how can we think about the contemporary events in Myanmar in the last 3 years or so in its broader historical and cultural context. And you can see in the picture before you that I'm beginning the story essentially in 1885, 1886, when the monarchy was dismantled by the British. And what I will actually argue today is that what we are seeing, the complexities, the challenges, and a lot of dynamics that we are seeing today are basically over a struggle for the nation, a struggle for national identity. But I will return to this theme periodically through the talk. Let's get right into it. Many of you will probably be very familiar with the developments that we've been seeing in really the last 3 years, and perhaps even for those Myanmar watchers for the last 10, 20 years. What's been quite important is we've seen a major transition between what was before a military government led by General Thwin and a hybrid military/civilian government led by a former general named Thwin. And of course, for many of those who have watched Myanmar affairs recently, the transition has been remarkable for many who felt that the military would probably never give up their power. We've seen a range of developments, and I will go over those just to set the immediate context for our discussion. We remember that in 2010 they had national elections, which was not necessarily as smooth as people might have expected, or perhaps it was actually not smooth in the sense that it was the first time since the 1990s. It brought in the formation of a new government, a government that immediately started to initiate new civil liberties, eased a number of restrictions on the press, on really it's the position of the state in relationship to society. And what this initiated for the rest of the world was a sense that it gave the impetus for the lifting of economic sanctions, which had been in place since 1990 as part of the diplomatic effort to open Myanmar up, which had apparently been closed to the Western world for nearly 20 to 30 years. Aung San Suu Kyi, the current MP and chairperson, was eventually released from house arrest. Her story is well known to many international observers. In fact, many actually associate her directly with whatever happens in Myanmar. So a lot of the experiences and understanding of Myanmar tends to be associated with her, and I hope today to add more to that story. During this time of reform with this new government, there was a period what I would like to call the sort of flurry in Myanmar mania, a sort of exuberance in many ways of this opening, sort of the equivalence of the fall of the Berlin Wall, sort of the equivalence of the collapse of the Soviet Union, and a more opening up of Myanmar society. We see Aung San Suu Kyi receiving congressional and eventually the Nobel Peace Prize award in person, and we saw a lot of dignitaries from the Myanmar cabinet traveling, engaging the international community. There's President Thein Sein speaking at the UN. He was also a guest of the Obama administration several times. And this seemed to signal that a new chapter had seemed to be opening up after a period of a rather isolated period in Myanmar's history. And this departing from isolation was very much connected to the role of the United States and other Western governments that previously imposed sanctions, as I had mentioned earlier. With this political opening up, we saw a rush, and many of you are probably interested in the investments into the country. And the government, whereas earlier had shied away from developing economic partnerships with Western countries, we're now seeing overt recruitment of Western investments. And the West, in turn, accelerated that engagement through multiple sectors, from education to health to power and heavy industry and so on. So there's a real big push, as you probably know right now, going into Myanmar as sort of the last frontier of economics in Asia. Now, this is pretty much the establishment narrative that most people talk about in the media, as well as by those who are in international relations and those who perhaps work for advocacy groups and so on. The story has been basically that the relationship that we've seen since 1988 is one of a post-Cold War narrative, where you have an authoritarian government that is holding back the organic, natural movements toward democracy. A trend that began in 1988 with the student uprising, which I will talk about a little bit later. This trend seemed to mirror other movements in Eastern Europe, as well as in parts of Asia that we saw a little bit later in South Korea, as well as the Philippines. And so it seemed like Myanmar was going to be moving along the same sort of trajectory, except that it had not. And this brought a lot of concern for a new post-Cold War era, where it seemed that most nations were moving towards the market economy and embracing democratic ideals and norms. The story was set within a dichotomy of a country that was isolated, that did not want to be, didn't want to engage with the world, a country that had sort of closed onto itself since the 1960s, and only now was sort of opening up to the rest of the world. It's a story that pitted internal change, or the inability to change, with the forces of change that were coming from the outside. This is a story and these are themes that reassert themselves in many media accounts, as well as analyst appraisals of what's been going on. We see Obama and Hillary Clinton walking through Socio-Political in 2012. Socio-Political is one of the most significant cultural sites within Myanmar, one of the most famous Buddhist sites. But within this narrative, you have a lot of unresolved issues. A lot of it that we've actually seen in the past year, from communal violence in the Western Rakhine State against the Rohingya, or the so-called Rohingya. That's a contested name. We can get into that later. All the other minority groups, Muslim citizens even, and so there's been violence and ultra-nationalist movements carrying on through the country, showing that things are not as stable or as optimistic as this opening might seem to appear. The peace process is moving forward, but it's also it's going through a rough period because there are ethnic groups and separatist movements that have not yet signed agreements. They're moving towards a national ceasefire accord, and one of the major groups, the Kachin, are in processes of moving forward to sign. The peace process is gaining traction. This is part of a broader effort of national reconciliation that has not had the opportunity to reach fruition, and this is a major issue that we will return to later as well. People in recent weeks have been hearing about constitutional reform, especially Article 59F, which has to do with the future leadership of the country and the eligibility of candidates to run for the president. Obviously, Aung San Suu Kyi is very much connected to this issue. And poverty alleviation, which I would imagine that a number of your organizations are interested in, is also a major issue of both the governments and NGO groups within the country. These are some of the unresolved issues and some of the major challenges facing the country. In addition to the lack of infrastructure and capacity, Myanmar has been in a pretty desperate social economic state for decades. Part of it was due to 10 to 20 years of flawed economic policies under the socialist regime, but also had to do with the sanctions from the West. We will get into that a little bit later as well. There's apparent struggle between reformers and conservatives within the current government. That is a dynamic that could hurt the trajectory of the reform process. Where it's going to go, we are not sure, but it's really going to depend on the 2015 elections. We'll talk about that later as well. Other questions are really about the role of the military. Are they going to give up power? Will they give up their 25% guaranteed seats in the parliament? Will we see a more civilian sort of government? These are issues that are part of the standard narrative of Myanmar. So essentially the problem has been associated with political factors, and what I'm going to be talking about today is an alternative narrative that takes us further back from 1988 to 1948 at the beginning of independence, following World War II and following the detachment and the withdrawal of the British. So what we see actually in this alternative narrative is a long civil war that leads up to 2011. And this complicates what we interpret. Instead of interpreting things within the context of the Cold War, and instead of the context that talks about things in terms of democracy, what we're seeing are internal debates over what the future of the country is going to be. And many of these folks and people, like you see here, the Karen National Union in the picture, are armed and have been armed for the last 20, 30 years. I've been fighting one of the most prolonged civil wars in the world, for that matter. What we see is perhaps a struggle of identity over who the Myanmar people, how they see themselves, determining how they belong, what the country should be, what models should be evoked, what direction they should go, who should be their leaders. These are debates that have been going on for the last 50 or 60 years. And so what we are seeing today perhaps can be put within that context as well. And finally, I'd like to suggest that we think about some of the social, economic, and cultural factors that are very much also a part of the story as well. These aspects seem to be placed on the side of the conversation as opposed to being very centrally a part of it. And again, these are probably issues that many of your groups that you represent are probably interested in. So my approach today will essentially be talking, as you can see on the graph on the right-hand side, essentially this trajectory of different communities of of Myanmar, each of them representing a particular different idea, a particular different notion of what the Burmese community should be, from the colonial period in 1824 all the way to 1942, to the Socialist Republic Union of Burma from 1962 to 1988, and onwards, of course, to the current situation. I'm going to suggest that what we've been seeing really is a long contest for the state over these over 100 years. It's been a struggle over political power, it's been a struggle over resources, but internally it's also a struggle over Myanmar identity. And what does it mean to be a Myanmar? What does it mean to be a Myanmar citizen? We're seeing these debates right now. Who belongs, who should get the resources, who should be calling the shots, and so on. So what this enables us to do is to place these contemporary events within their historical and cultural context. And what I will argue is essentially what we're seeing is that there are a lot of communities right now who imagine Myanmar differently, and establishing political consensus has been a challenge. We have groups that have had different historical experiences throughout this long period of history with different priorities, different needs, and they have formed different political constituencies along the way. And finally, that these notions of belonging and identity and affiliation affect the political stability of the country. And we're seeing this within debates within the leadership as today. But I'd like to go on and give a little bit of background about the socio-cultural setting, which very few people actually talk about. And very few folks actually realize what a diverse place Myanmar actually is. If you can see the different landscapes where communities have developed, you have mountainous areas, you've got a river valley area where you can see the little red dots in here. This is where most of the major cities have developed throughout the centuries. And it's easy to see how these communities who have developed along that area might have a more cohesive sense of who they are. But those living in the mountain areas are very much detached. And so I always tell my students that the hill tribes, the hill communities are very much different from the valley girls and the valley guys who are residing in different areas. They have different perspectives of the world. They have different needs and different priorities. This also holds true for those who live on the coastlines, and also the differences between those who are living upstream and downstream. The types of communities, the types of worldviews, the types of people have are definitely connected to the geography and to where they live. There's a book called 100 Horizons about the Indian Ocean and the different communities living around there. That applies to Myanmar as well. The different horizons, of course, being the different perspectives through which people live. You can see here another sort of social cultural setting here. Again, the differences in geography, and there you see where the UN sites are and some of the NGO camps are along the borderlands. But what's very distinctive, of course, is the mountainous area where a lot of the ethnic groups live, and the river valley areas where the dominant Burmese live, the Burmans live. And this dynamic between ethnic groups, ethnic minorities, and the majority of Burmans is very much has translated to a political legacy today that's shaped the way on which the nation has moved. You've got different language families, which has compounded this sense of variety, this sense of different communities. You have hundreds of sub-dialects, so the parts of language are very much connected to the struggle over the nation. People sometimes identify themselves differently from religion. This has mostly come up in recent years, especially between Muslims and Buddhists. But there's also a lot of intermixing amongst the different groups as well. My own family, for instance, some are Christian, others see themselves as Buddhists, some see themselves as agnostic, and so forth. So there's a range of ways that people can identify themselves, but religion is definitely part of that. We'd like to suggest that as a result, historically, you've got different historical experiences. Partly it's because many of these communities have been exposed to different cultural influences at different intensities. So if you're in the coastal cities, for instance, or if you're in the urban areas, you're going to be exposed to different types of influences and values than those perhaps in the agricultural and rural areas, or from those in the highlands. And this creates different types of experiences in terms of social economic stratification, as well as the priorities over, do you align yourself with your local leader or those in the national capital. And this has actually been a challenge that's been going on throughout Burmese history. Who do you align your loyalties towards? Is it towards those in the center, the capitals, or to your local leaders? And just like politics, even in the U.S. or anywhere today, it's often local politics that are actually take over. It's some people, I think it was Kissinger who said all politics are local, and it's very much the case in Myanmar. You have different emerging worldviews and different notions of belonging. And one of the key points, as you can see there in the map, is that the closer you were to the center, so you can see the center of the old Bagan Empire in the 11th and 13th centuries, the closer you were, of course, the influence was stronger. The farther you are, the less the influence was. And this dynamic continues on today. Naypyidaw is around here in the center, the national capital, and they are struggling to keep the periphery in the fold. They're struggling to get the periphery to buy into the national idea. And a lot of these relationships are based on what we call patron-client relations or personal relations. Horizontal connection or affiliation is ideas that they were all Burmese citizens are really not that strong right now. People align themselves with their local leaders, which are based on very much local personal relations. So the social cultural legacies we see from the pre-colonial period is that you have power centered on individuals and support networks. And this, of course, makes it difficult even today, or especially today, when you're trying to either invest into a particular sector and so forth. You have to meet a particular official, and you meet that person's supporters and so forth without really knowing whether things are going to change if that guy gets replaced or not. And it continues on today. So social bonds that are hierarchical, very much still a dynamic as well today. Communities are loosely connected, and this bond of national identity is definitely starting to take shape, but the local identities tend to be much stronger. And as I mentioned earlier, tensions between the center and these local areas are continuing to exist. And in some ways, the recent influx of investments coming from China as well as the West are lubricating these differences, as local ethnic groups who want to have a piece of the pie are resisting the legislation made by the capital to regulate this influx of funding, because they don't want to lose out, essentially. And so you have these these center-peripheral dynamics. These tensions and divisions are being compounded by the new funding that's coming in through the country. So managing these different levels of relationships is something that people have to keep in mind. So what I'll be talking now will be really some of the historical periods that lead up to these different types of identities. The British Burma period, the colonial period, created, after 3 wars, a colony that was attached to India. And it completely unraveled the Burmese conceptual universe by interrupting, essentially, 1,000 years of monarchy, and bringing into Burmese consciousness and bringing into the Burmese universe new sets of ideas and values, priorities, cultural expressions, senses of self-worth, and so on. You have new boundaries, for instance, that differentiated how a community might be organized. You have some communities that were torn apart, divided by an arbitrary line, or some that were actually brought together, which had no business being together. So, for instance, you might have a community on either side of a river that was completely connected through marriage and through business relationships and so forth, but now we're technically under a new administrative unit. This created different notions of loyalty, different senses of authority and legitimacy during the colonial period. It reconfigured the ways in which people thought about themselves. And it certainly, the colonial period definitely created new economic opportunities, and there was an economic transformation with the developments of Lower Myanmar, which had always been a backwater to Burmese. Their orientation had normally been towards China, as you can see in the map. Most people thought, well, the British were coming through the front door. Well, it's because the British saw themselves as coming through the front door, the ocean. But to the Burmese perspective, the front door was China. The Burmese were coming through the back door, or to mimic a Beatles song, they're coming through the bathroom window. They had also new notions of authority, whereas political authority in Burma was based on kingship and Buddhist notions that were actually borrowed from India. This new wave of legitimacy was coming through notions of secular Indian law. And so they had new notions of authority and legitimacy, new cultural buildings to represent what that authority might be. And the Buddhist world essentially fragmented. You had new education coming in, which created new elites who would then take over the role of leadership in the absence of the monarchy. When I look at this picture that you see in the slide here, I always imagine my grandmother being there, because my grandmother was very much part of that traditional elite. She was Anglo-Burmese. She was Karen. She was a minority. And she, in a sense, thought herself more as being British than, in a sense, Burmese. She knew all the works of Jane Austen before she knew any Burmese author, in fact. And so these new elites represented a new political group who sought reform in different ways, similar to the ways reform is going on now. The idea, though, is you have different notions of reform and different methods towards it. A problem that's going on now was going on then as well. Some of the traditional old elites, for instance, wanted to revert to the older system. Others wanted to seek reform through the British system. And a third group wanted to seek reform by replacing the colonial system. And that was eventually the group that took over. This new nationalists, many of them were under what was called the General Council of the Burmese Associations, formed political parties. But then, like now, many of these political parties were divided over these personal relationships. The political leaders who would have their followers, and they divided hierarchically. So often, you would have a political party who was very powerful, and they would often divide and split up over personalities, differences over the leadership. This, in a sense, explains things that are going on with the NLD, the National League for Democracy, back in 2010, when there was a debate over whether to participate in elections or not. The moderates split up, the hardliners stayed on. Well, we'll return to that later. Rural communities were also isolated from the urban cities and urban political networks, although there was some connection. Radical students saw things quite differently than the older generation. They wanted not to work within the system, they wanted to replace the system. So they often felt that the only way they could actually do that was to seek external support from outsiders, a tactic that, of course, has also been used in recent times as well. But at that time, the colonial state limited the political space, and many of these radicals were imprisoned. And they didn't get freed, really, until World War II, when the Japanese invaded, opened up the prisons, and the prisoners came out and joined the Burmese Independence Army. And those leaders, like Aung San, you see here, he's right there in the middle, ended up forming the origins of what essentially would be the Burmese Army, the only institution that would last from World War II all the way into the post-colonial period. During this time, the defeat of Japan created a power vacuum, and so what this meant was when the British decided to leave, it meant that the boundaries of the colonial state remained, but the power structure remained empty. There was a power vacuum. So radicals, those British Burmese elites who had cooperated with the colonial state or had worked within it, plus the Burmese army, all started to struggle essentially for the nation. And that struggle has continued on today. So you had multiple stakeholders with competing visions, different loyalties, following different personalities. I'll give you an example. Aung San was leader of the APFFL, the Anti-Fascist People's Freedom League. His brother-in-law was head of the communists. And when the communists were not included in the future of the nation, they ended up rebelling right after independence was declared. Karens, who were worried about a minority group who were worried about their place in the nation, also decided to rebel and have a separatist movement. So we can see, and a lot of these leaders of these different groups all went to school together, or all had been part of the Burmese Independent Army together and had fought the Japanese together. But because now there was a power vacuum, they started to split up. These types of dynamics are very much still in play today as well. The post-colonial community between 1948 and 1962 is often seen as, by folks who see the history of Burma within a story of democracy, as a period of democracy, actually, that was interrupted by the military coup. In some ways, you can definitely see that. But at the same time, what we should also realize is that the parliamentary system that was continued after the British by many of these elites who had been working for the British before didn't have much power at all. They only held Yangon. The rest of the country was essentially held by armed separatist groups, thugs, paramilitary groups, communists, and so on. So the post-World War II government had a very unstable situation facing them. They needed to try to unify the country, and that was becoming very hard to do with so many vested interests in play. And civil war essentially erupted between 48 and 60, or actually 48 until 2011. And this is the context that I think needs to be brought up a little bit more in order to understand really the momentous changes that have occurred in recent years. You had a period of crisis and stability, as I mentioned. U, the first prime minister, tried to unify the country through Buddhism, but of course there were many groups who were not Buddhists and who felt, well, I'm not going to really be part of this country with the future if the national identity is associated with this religion. U eventually, his government really had very little power and initially asked the army to step in as part of a caretaker role in 1958. They returned power in 1960, but clearly the government was weak and it looked like the communists were going to take over. American government was actually very worried about this, as were other Western governments, and the military took over in 1962, which is interesting because the Western governments that criticized the military in more recent years were not criticizing them back then during the context of the Cold War. So what we see basically between 62 and 88 under General Thwin was a struggle for the nation, but with the Revolutionary Council, with the military in power, the only institution that was able to essentially carry on from World War II. The expansion of the military and its integration of the country was essentially an expansion of the military state. They adopted socialism, which appealed to notions of equality and so on. Socialism was very much a part of the reading list on many of these young students who eventually became part of the army. But it was disastrous, of course, because just as we all know, they were able to redistribute resources, but they weren't able to create new resources. So this ideology was adopted and internalized and localized to form a sort of national agenda, which concentrated mainly on focusing on the peasants and the agricultural sector to the neglect of the urban area. And there was a shift towards involving a socialist party. So you had socialist members as well as socialist military members, and the lines often cross. So this is a hybrid government that we actually might compare to the current government. During this period, you had nation building, which was a very strong period where that Buddhist past was emphasized, and peasants and their role in the national history was very much celebrated. But often minority experiences were neglected, and this is part of the challenge today. Minority groups who are sitting in very strategic areas, of course, because they have these national resources in these areas, never saw themselves as part of this nation, or part of this national history, or part of this national culture. And so the lines of and bonds of community have often been very loose, very tenuous, because they were never really connected. The central economy was planned, but as I mentioned earlier, whereas the rural sector received what little resources the government had, the urban development was neglected. And by 1988, I mean, the country was and very much economic in the red. And in the late 1980s, essentially the national economy collapsed. The currency was demonetized. Armed insurgencies continued to fight against the government, and so the government actually called for meetings to resolve what was a broad crisis. The whole country seemed to be coming to a halt. It's during this period that we saw the 1988 demonstrations. Now, again, it's very important to see the 88 demonstrations within the context of democracy, but it's also important to see these demonstrations within the context of this longer struggle and these post-colonial challenges that were facing the country. University student protests erupted during this period, and they went and dissolved the BSPP and called for a referendum because he realized it was as expensive to stay out of the world economy as it would have been to stay within it. And so he pushed forward the question, should we have to go to a multi-party system? Political stakeholders saw this as an opportunity, and so we saw here at this period the rise of old politicians who had been sidelined in the past. This is also the period when Aung San Suu Kyi came into the public view. The military stepped in and essentially reestablished their role in it. So you shifted from a hybrid civilian military government to a straight-on military direct rule, which was the government that we saw essentially until today. So what I'd like to end with is that what we've seen is a long civil war and reconstruction period, a struggle for the state, a struggle for resources, and a struggle for between the center and the periphery. The country has never been really united, both in terms of administratively, culturally, or even psychologically. In the 1990s, we saw, as you said, urban reform movements, and seen through the protesting students and so forth. Well, we also saw continuation of these rural separatist movements that had begun since the late 1940s. Many of these groups were essentially debating what's the future of the nation. Which way should we go? What model should we invoke? Who has the right to lead and in what way? And there's definitely also a continuing debate over the nature of the Reconstruction. How do we reconstruct? How do we initiate reform? Whose reform plans should we use? I always like to suggest that in the past American elections between Romney and Obama, both were talking about economic reform. Both wanted to reform the country, but they had very different ways of doing it. Similar types of debates were going on in Myanmar in the 90s and the early part of the 21st century, except these groups were armed. And so what you have is you have competing visions of the country. The 1990 Constituent Assembly elections, which were supposed to set up the assembly to write the Constitution, that didn't work out. The National League for Democracy wanted to skip that level and take power right away, although the Constituent Assembly elections stipulated that a certain process had to be established first. So there's debate over what those 1990 elections actually meant. The National League for Democracy actually were led by former generals who were purged by the current set of generals. Again, to emphasize this notion that you've got divisions within groups and that is not often seen from the outside. The disagreement over what elections meant also created a polarized image of that this was essentially a military versus democracy movement, which is something like it's easy and more digestible in a media context, but it definitely obfuscated the complexities that were going on at the time. Interesting enough, the government also adopted democracy as part of its political agenda. So you had Aung San Suu Kyi and her movement, and you had the roadmap to democracy being led by the military, which is actually the process that we are seeing today. So it started back in the 1990s. It was able to secure ceasefire agreements with ethnic groups. In the 1990s and early 21st century, we had about 17 ceasefire groups for the first time in about 60 years, which laid the foundation for the types of reforms that we see today. And recently, in the last year or two, we've actually seen 13 more ceasefire agreements reached. They held a national convention and referendum, contested and problematic, of course. and which led, of course, to the 2010 civilian rule elections, which promised civilian rule. We still see fissures today. Domestic issues are internationalized, which creates a lot of pressure for the stakeholders on the ground, for politicians on the ground. Intense pressure on all sides. Aung San Suu Kyi is now facing that pressure a little bit more now that she's part of the government. Thein Sein and other political leaders are also facing scrutiny over every decision that they make. So domestic issues are international ones. And what's been important is that now there's been a shift where the issues and the approaches of the government have been receiving support from the outside world. So now you have a little bit more political space within which to work. Internal rivalries are still very much a part of the landscape, which is both a challenge to both immediate and long-term reform. Urban and rural unrest in the last year has been devastating. It's been distracting for the government and for NGOs on the ground who are trying to get projects online with the new funding coming in. And definitely the international community tends to be still divided over, which way Myanmar should go. And what I think some folks need to remember is that this is very much an internal process. That change often occurs only from within, and we can provide advice and funding to lubricate change, but essentially they're going to have to decide on their own. Broad patterns then that what we see is that Reconstruction begins in the 1990s, and whereas we're seeing a decentralized, forming of decentralized states based on democratic models and institutions, we're also seeing a reintegration of that same state, an economic expansion. So we have new legislation going in to manage the funding coming in, to manage banking, to manage investments, taxes, reform, and so on. And this is good for some groups, but for other groups, they may see it as a threat. Ethnic groups are beginning to align themselves with the national community, as I mentioned, with the signing of ceasefire agreements, with the buying into the overall reconciliation process, but you're seeing some groups that are a little bit hesitant and wary due to this long history of struggle. And what we're in the midst of, I would argue, is still a transition from this military government to a more hybrid one. So finally, I guess I'd like to leave it off that what we're seeing, as I mentioned, is a long-term struggle that will likely continue, but hopefully not through armed conflicts. And that Myanmar continues to be imagined differently by the stakeholders. And as we're seeing right now, with both the economic resources as well as the issues of the Constitution, reaching a consensus is going to be a challenge. And the political leaders are going to have to decide whether consensus or confrontation is the way to go about. And unfortunately, in Burmese politics, at least the history of Burmese politics, confrontation seems to be more the norm than consensus. Expectations for the future of Myanmar is definitely based on different priorities. It's depending on who you ask. If you're asking ethnic minorities in the hills, they're going to have definitely different ideas about what the future is than those who are operating in Yangon, Naypyidaw, and Mandalay. And finally, I would like to point out, and I think this is relevant to many of the organizations that you folks are all involved in, is that bread and butter issues are often really what makes people move and what makes people think. It's not political ideology that we often think is driving the nation on the minds of people, but it's healthcare, it's housing, it's electricity, it's education, it's having medicine and plumbing and so on, having a future for kids and having some security in your retirement. These are issues that I think most Burmese are actually thinking about. I certainly know from my family in the country that that's how they are feeling. Thanks very much for your time. I think I might have gone a little bit over. I'd be happy to entertain any of your questions and comments in the discussion session.
No worries at all, Maitrii. Thanks for the very comprehensive overview of Burmese history in such a short amount of time. We've had several questions coming in while you were going through the presentation, and maybe I will cut to questions related to the more recent slides. I guess your points around the bread and butter issues that are pressing right now in the country, if you could speak a little bit more about them and maybe provide a sense for what are the priorities around those issues? And this was
yes,
a couple of questions from Yingluck and Deirdre.
Okay, great. Yes, this is the parameters are definitely depending on who you ask and where you're asking. For the cities where most people tend to go, especially from those who are visiting and who are trying to set up these types of programs, it's infrastructure and capacity building. And name it, any sector is really what needs work. We're at a stage in Myanmar where it's not, when we talk about infrastructure development, it's not even at the level of putting in, cables and Wi-Fi and so forth and plumbing. But it's basically, you need basic urban reconstruction going on, urban planning from the very beginning, just to enable infrastructural developments and funding to come in. I'll give you an example. A Japanese company wanted to go in and build essentially a subway for the Burmese, but the Burmese government couldn't provide the electricity to power the drills. So they said, well, you guys got to come in and provide your own electricity. So you got to have an electric grid first, which is actually happening right now. You got to have that electric grid before the next level of infrastructure development comes in. Another example, this has to do with obviously for those who want to invest in the country. Yes, it's good that you have the the foreign investment law put in 2012, but you also need tax reform. And for American companies who I've talked to, they need to have a tax, tax laws that the IRS will be able to recognize. So just being able to have a financial apparatus to protect one's investments is something that needs to be in place. But the particular sectors that are, of course, that are drawing a lot of attention are the power sector, natural resources, and so on. But what I think for long-term developments, as has been repeated by I think others, specialists in the area, it's really the long-term, the basic infrastructure, healthcare, medicine, to education especially. That's what I'm more familiar with, and dealing with those basic needs from housing to transport. We're talking about the excitement about having these telecom companies coming in, and I'm thinking, the 70% of the population lives in rural areas. I'm not sure they're going to be worried about their iPhones. They're going to be worried about getting housing and plumbing and these sorts of things. Having food and having fertilizer, for the crops and so forth. More often than not, we think the Myanmar experience is that what we see in Yangon. That's a very urban one. The rural one is very different, and there's differentiation within the rural agricultural community as well. So there are a range of sectors that need attention. And the government has said this in 2011, that the immediate thing they want to focus on is poverty alleviation. And that's the key for them. And they have a new framework for social and economic development that was released in 2013. It's essentially a 3-year plan that's supposed to be a bridge between previous broad plans and the future 20-year comprehensive economic plan. This is the bridging plan, and it outlines what and where funding is going to be going into, and where the government's going to be focusing on. And that's been that's available to anyone who decides to get it from the Ministry of National Development and Economic Planning.
Okay, very interesting. Is there a particular name for this plan that folks can Google for?
Yes, well, this framework is called the Framework for Economic and Social Reform.
Okay, got it.
not very sexy, but it's and I think there's reference to this plan written. I don't actually have the actual citation for it, but there was a fellow from the Brookings Institute that wrote a report about the broad social economic plans that are going forth, and this is part of that. But it's a 20-year plan, and that should give people some confidence, because never before has there been really such integration with both the national as well as ASEAN's economic development plans. You have to remember, 2015, they're going to be launching the ASEAN Economic Community. So Myanmar's economic integration plans are aligned with ASEAN's at the same time. So they're both doing regional integration as well as domestic integration, which is something, for Myanmar watchers, is unheard of in terms of coordination.
Okay, great. We also have a question around sanctions in sort of on Myanmar, and I mean, if you could speak to what is the situation with that and to what extent they've been lifted.
Right. Yes. Except with I'll just sort of give a broad overview. At least since 1990s, have been having economic sanctions over the last couple of years. Many of them have been lifted. The EU has lifted most of them, except for those dealing with arms shipments and so on. The Americans have lifted much of their economic sanctions as well, but they're still holding up on some, and those are having to do with the financial side. And I was just in Washington in December speaking to folks both from the State Department as well as representatives from the President's cabinet. And they were asking the American side, will you guys speed up both funding as well as drop some of these sanctions so that we can get moving on some of these initiatives that are being held back. Most of the curbing has to do, from what I understand, has to do on the financial side. But at the same time, the U.S. has lifted quite a few sanctions as well. So there's very few remaining. And I think, the American government is holding on to them for leverage. But I think they're probably due to lift the final ones. I don't know the specifics of which exact sanctions they are, but they are listed on the U.S. websites.
Okay.
I'm not sure when they're going to lift them, but it's got to be pretty soon.
Okay, got it. And if you could speak to the state of civil society in Myanmar, and to what extent is its development, and sort of what is the prevalence of local NGOs?
Yeah, well, the opening of space for these for civil society is definitely increasing. I mean, just if you look in the last 2 years with the association law, the easing of the media, and so on, there's much more room to navigate in Yangon than there was before. The trouble is you got a bunch of groups coming in and they don't know what to do, because you can set up and so forth your operations, but the capacity to actually deliver on a lot of these initiatives is what's holding people back because of the various infrastructural obstacles. So I mean, I've got a cousin who was working in a domestic NGO for years, and they've been quite successful because they've basically modified what their goals have been given the local context. There have been others that have been going on since 1950 that weren't called NGOs then, but essentially they're NGOs now. And this one, which is dealing with education, has been basically supported by Department of Education and the Ministry of Department of Basic Instruction. These guys are officials who are donating their times to bring education to rural areas. The network is absolutely fantastic. It's survived 3 successive governments, and the government likes it because they're doing things more effectively than the government is able to do. So there is space for civil society, and if you're focusing on sectors that are of mutual benefits, especially now, I mean, I think there's a lot of potential to develop some very important projects. And if you just follow ADB's work, they're able to leverage their position on precisely these areas, on education, on water management, on electricity, and so on.
Okay, great. I think we've got time for one final question, and something that I've been wondering myself as well. Burma or Myanmar, what is the more appropriate way of referring to the country?
Yeah, I mean, right now, all international legal documents and agreements use Myanmar. So if you want to do any sort of arrangement with the country, it's advisable to use Myanmar, because legally Burma is not going to work. And so that'll be a major priority for you. In terms of the terms, I mean, one is literary Burmese and one's colloquial Burmese. Burma is colloquial for the country. Myanmar is literary, but it was politicized in the 80s as representing a particular political stance. But really, it's like China and Chongwon. It's you have an internal name that people use, and you have an external name that people use. So Right now, I think it's more politically correct. If you want to do business there, if you want to invest and start programs, I think calling the name of the country is within the language is probably a good idea. I grew up saying Burma, not for political reasons, but because my dad, who's Burmese, always said Burma, and he came from a Burmese English family, so I still continue to use Burma. But when I'm in the country, I say Myanmar. If I'm speaking with the Burmese speakers, I'll say Myanmar. I'll be just out of being polite as opposed to any political sense or anything like that.
Okay, great, great. Well, Maitrii, thank you so much for sharing your deep expertise and experience on today's webinar. We have Maitrii's email address right in front of you on the webinar screen, so feel free to follow up with him on any other questions you might have, or if you need help with further content around sort of Burmese history or Myanmar as a country. To everyone on this call, thank you for your participation. I hope you found the presentation useful. Please take a minute to fill up the feedback form that will pop up as soon as this webinar closes. Thank you, and see you again at a future AVPN event. Take care. Bye.